Free speech has been arguably the most powerful engine of human equality that our species has come upon.
I think when you have these debates about free speech, that everything should be up for debate, however offensive, that tends to privilege sort of the far right, it tends to privilege bigots, it tends to privilege anti-science.
Welcome to Doha Debates, where we explore an urgent issue from various sides and try to find common ground. Get ready for a conversation that's well-informed, spirited, civil, and respectful. If you like what you hear in these debates, click like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Hey there, I'm Joshua Johnson, and I'll be your moderator for today's debate. And today we're talking about the limits of free speech. Now, this hits home for us because our debates involve wrestling with big, complicated issues and searching for the truth. And that feels increasingly challenging in a world that is filled with online misinformation. Now, anyone can have a platform. But should everyone have a platform? Is everything up for debate? Or should some things just be out of bounds? According to the United Nations, hate speech on social media targets minority groups at least 70% of the time. Now, this can have consequences offline, too. A report from the Council on Foreign Relations links online hate speech to more violence against minorities around the world. Now, different countries define hate speech in different ways. Some nations have struggled to limit hate speech while protecting free speech. Back in 2022, the New Humanitarian, which covers humanitarian crises, reported that 80% of the world had less freedom of expression than it did the decade before. But then, how much should freedom of expression include ideas that could get people hurt? That's why various democracies are taking a number of approaches to this. Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee, has a nonpartisan think tank called the Future of Free Speech. It analyzed laws in almost 24 countries from 2015 to 2022. Researchers found that nearly 80% of those laws aimed to restrict free expression. For example, an anti-radicalization plan in Denmark included 5 laws restricting religious speech. In South Korea, a person can be imprisoned for defaming, insulting, or even swearing at someone. So, what's the best approach? Are some views just too awful to debate? Or is everything up for debate? Today's panelists are going to help us think that through. Joining us from Nashville is Mchangama. He's the founder and executive director of the Future of Free Speech at Vanderbilt. He's also the author of Free Speech, A History from Socrates to Social Media. And he hosted a podcast called Clear and Present Danger, A History of Free Speech. Mchangama, welcome to Doha Debates. Good to have you with us.
Thank you so much. Pleasure to be here.
Joining us from London is David Stubbs. He's a longtime journalist and author focusing largely on music and culture. He's the author of Different Times, A History of British Comedy. And in it, he argues that British comedy has gotten better as it got kinder and more inclusive. David Stubbs, welcome. Good to have you with us.
Lovely to be here.
Later, we will include our global listeners with their own perspectives and questions. And as always, we have 2 ground rules. First, no personal attacks. We're here to pick apart the issue and not each other. And secondly, every question requires a direct answer. Thinking out loud is perfectly fine. I don't know is a totally acceptable answer, but please don't pivot to another topic until you've addressed the issue at hand. And please, my personal pet peeve, do not answer a question with a question. With that said, David, let me start with you. You have said that there should be some limits on speech and on public debate. Tell us why and where we should draw that line.
I think when you have these debates about free speech, that everything should be up for debate, however offensive, that tends to privilege sort of the far right, it tends to privilege bigots, it tends to privilege anti-science. Because if you think of like leftist liberal ideas, I mean, brotherly love, peace, social equality, anti-racism. I mean, a fairer, more just world, inclusivity. You don't have to be a psychopath to be offended or disagree with those ideas. So quite often what happens when the kind of floodgates are open, when, we need to extend free speech, like I say, it tends to privilege, some of the most unpleasant and destructive and harmful elements in our society. Now, look, when I say freedom of speech, I'm not talking about some sort of Gestapo-type organisation coming and knocking on somebody's door if they're rumbling at the television or whatever, anything like that, or surveillance, or whatever. I'm talking about the issue of platforming. Now, in this country, in the UK, we had back in the year 2009, a fellow called Nick Griffin was invited on to Question Time, which is like the kind of flagship political panel debate show in the UK. And he was a member of the frankly racist British National Party. And it was a bit of a kind of unprecedented thing, yes, interview him, fine, whatever, but actually for him to be platformed in this way. And I was dead against it. And I went on demonstrations, to argue that he should not be appearing on that platform, that his views are beyond the pale. Other friends of mine, more liberal friends, say, no, let him express himself. I disagree with what you say, but defend to the death your right to say it, etc., etc. He did go on the show, and I think one of the sort of negative consequences of that was that those far right views became normalised by the privilege of being on a platform. Now, I don't think it's a freedom of speech issue. I don't think to be platformed on a show like Question Time, I think it's something that has to be earned, and the quality of his arguments and his ideas, I don't feel deserve that sort of normalisation.
Jakob Mchangama, let me come to you. Where do you see the line being properly drawn?
Yeah, so first of all, if you look at human history, it's really a millisecond that we've been sort of open, free democracies where you were able to speak truth to power, as it were. And unfortunately, it's still the case in many countries around the world that you can't challenge those who are in power. So what free speech and open debate does is that it presents a really radical alternative. So instead of being a zero-sum game of winner takes all by force, we can discuss our differences, we can reach compromise, and we can protect minority religious views and political dissent. And so in many ways, I actually think that free speech and open debate are the antithesis of violence. It really is the only way for free, open, and tolerant societies to try and secure a viable and lasting social peace. So, and then you might say, well, are there no limits? Of course there are limits. There are many limits to free speech, and I would say threats are a perfect example. Threats are not, you're not trying to come up with an argument, you're not making a viewpoint, you're simply trying to silence someone because you want to instill fear in them. Incitement to imminent violence is another example of something where I would draw the line. So in other words, I would protect bigoted views. I would protect the right of Nick Griffin to say horrible things about minorities, but not for Nick Griffin and jackbooted followers to stand outside a mosque or synagogue and call for people to take action against those minorities. So that's sort of an attempt to sort of distinguish between words and deeds, which has been an extremely important way to delineate permissible speech and non-permissible speech throughout the history of free speech. And there are those who say, well, and I think David says a little bit the same, that free speech privileges those who are the most extreme. I tend to think that's a wrong reading of history. Throughout the history of free speech has been arguably the most powerful engine of human equality that our species has come upon. So if you look at, religious, racial, sexual minorities, women, all groups that have been persecuted, discriminated against, their most important weapon has always been speech.
Jakob, let me stick with you for just a second. You were talking about how free speech has been one of these kind of robust tools that disenfranchised or minority groups have used to seek equality. That seems to have shifted a great deal in the era of social media. If you take Elon Musk, who bought Twitter and turned it into X, he calls himself a free speech absolutist. But since he bought it, a number of people who had been banned from Twitter for hoaxes or for hate speech have been reinstated by Elon Musk. And that fueled this argument about platforming, as David put it with Question Time and the BBC. It seems like now balance has shifted dramatically because all views are not presented equally. I want to make sure David has a chance to respond shortly, but Jakob, how do you see the impact of social media, of very rigidly controlled, kind of microscopically targeted algorithms on this overall issue?
So I think overall, social media is a benefit. I think that, we have a tendency as human beings to focus. We have a negativity bias. So we take all the benefits of social media for granted, and then we focus on all the negative sides. And they're certainly there. It's inevitable that if you give billions of people around the world a platform, you're going to encounter a lot of speech that can be hateful, offensive to various groups, and as people disagree about what is hateful and offensive, lots of people are going to be hurt by it. But it's also true that before social media, there was a very narrow elite of editors, journalists, politicians who were the de facto gatekeepers of what could be said in the public sphere. And I think it is to the benefit. If you were to look at did ethnical racial minorities, did they have more of a voice in the public sphere before or after social media? I think it's quite obvious that could Black Lives Matter, for instance, could that have had the same impact without social media? I think it's quite obvious that it would not be able to have the same impact. And someone like Elon Musk talks a big game about free speech, but what he really is just a hypocrite. He prioritizes speech that he agrees with, and then he shuts down speech that he doesn't like. And that is, unfortunately, it's something that I call Milton's curse, after John Milton, the English poet who wrote the famous work Areopagitica in 1643. That was a criticism of censorship in the United Kingdom, and it's often hailed as this timeless defense of free speech. When you look closer at it, John Milton says, yes, press freedom is really important, but certainly not for Catholics, certainly not for those who are too radical. Basically, it's just free speech for mainline Protestant sects, and I think that's unfortunately a tendency that we see throughout the history of free speech, is that people who champion free speech tend to change their minds and come up with exceptions for people that they don't like, especially when they're in power.
David, how do you see this issue in terms of connecting people on platforms whose views may be abhorrent, may be problematic, but are in a different kind of a space than, say, the BDC? What do you make of that situation in terms of these newer platforms, podcasting being a relatively new platform, I guess, and then social media as well, creating space for people, including people whose views may be abhorrent or problematic, to interact in spaces that are more niche, that are more targeted than, say, the BBC?
Yeah. I mean, as far as Twitter goes, oddly enough, I do actually agree. I would have got quite far on this one. I think that not only am I ultimately pro-Twitter, I think that if you're not on Twitter, you're really not getting the full range. As long as I think if you curate the kind of people that you follow, whatever, you're really not getting the full range of what's actually going on in the world, to be honest. Oddly enough, I do believe that. At the same time, I find Elon Musk utterly egregious in his literature. I agree, he is a hypocrite. He's brought back people like Graham Linehan, who was thrown off Twitter previously for his kind of aggressive, obnoxious transphobia that was ruining people's lives. And he brought back Donald Trump, a known serial liar who's involved in a number of criminal cases. And I think, quite simply, they should never have been re-platformed. If you think in the pre-Twitter era, there were certain things that if people want to say them, then you're going to have to scrawl on toilet walls or keep them to themselves or to one or two other people, whatever. But then along comes Twitter, and you've got what my old Oxford Don used to call the authority of the printed word. So now, views that you espouse, they're in the same font as the views expressed by Barack Obama or Brian Cox or whatever. And I think that's a backward step. And I think certain bad ideas have been revived as a result of this. All kinds of obnoxious ideas have now been able to kind of resume traction. I just don't think people talk about discussion. Everything should be up for discussion, for debate, but things shouldn't be in a perpetual state of discussion. Eventually, there has to be a conclusion to the debate. Say, no, look, these are the facts. certain things are just plain wrong. And anybody who insists, once they've got to that stage in trying to kind of resume and revive it, then, that might offend, like pure libertarians or post-structuralists or whatever. But I just think you do have to get to that stage, and a certain stage. And I think with the climate change, is an example of that. Because again, the BBC for a while, they were still doing this thing of inviting on like once a pro-climate change and one climate denier, as if this is sort of a 50-50 balance in kind of consensus, and there isn't. It's 99-1, if that. And the BBC's insistence on balance and insistence on kind of platforming both sides gave a disproportionate sense of like the nature of the argument and like what the science on it is. I think even the BBC got to the stage now where they realise you can't do that. I mean, for one thing, just the paramountness of freedom of speech. There are more important things at stake, and this is one of them, the future of the planet. And, I would hate that to be jeopardized just for the sort of sake of preserving this principle of freedom of speech.
There are a lot of questions about the limits of free speech in the news right now. I mean, you take the protests that are happening on college campuses against the war in Gaza between Israel and Hamas. Traditionally, higher education's been a space where the free exchange of ideas is very much encouraged, but recently there's been an increasing number of students who've been getting arrested for their actions, for their opinions. When it comes to protest, and when it comes to the ways in which strong points of views can be construed as hateful, David, how do you see the balance needing to be struck there?
Well, when it comes to this particular situation, I am 100% in favour of the protesters. I believe that what's happening there is a genocide. Humanitarian crisis, I would go stronger than that. And I am absolutely in favour of of what they're doing and their attempt to sort of protest peacefully. And what I specifically object to in this situation is some of the framing that has gone on around this particular issue. For example, there was just recently there was a kind of we've seen a lot of scenes of like police violence perpetrated against people simply for the act of protesting, not for any not for like instigating violence of their own. We've seen like a counter protest. I've seen footage of like some of the pro-Israeli person launch a firework, a huge firework. I mean, that's attempted murder into one of the encampments. That's attempted murder. But it was framed, when we were talking about, I think it was on the BBC, they talked about like, the police concerned after horrific acts of violence at the encampment. They didn't specify who was like actually perpetrating these acts of violence, and then implied that violence was coming from the protesters. Look, any sort of legitimate expression of anti-Semitism by any, if somebody out there, death to Jews, something like that, that should be, as far as I'm concerned, the person that should be immediately prosecuted. They should face consequences for that. But what you are seeing also a lot of the time is a kind of conflation, for example, of Israel with Jewish people in general. That's another sort of weaponization, which in a sense is anti-Semitic in his own right, whatever. The idea of conflating Jews with Israelis, whatever. You're also like claiming that, for instance, the phrase "from the river to the sea" is anti-Semitic, even though it's used in Likud's own charter, or even the phrase "free Palestine," implying that that's anti-Semitic, as if the only acceptable position that you can have that's non-anti-Semitic is for there to be a captive Palestine. It's what I would call a semantic land grab that's going on. And I think this is, and a lot of the, Jakob was talking very early on about, the idea of like settling down, having a sort of discussion rather than like hacking each other with swords or whatever, and settling down, have a debate and reaching compromise. But I think that's only possible when all parties are acting in good faith. And I just honestly believe that there are powerful forces in this whole issue who are simply not arguing in good faith.
Jakob, how do you see the debate about these protests on college campuses, particularly because of the intense concern, particularly in the United States, about anti-Semitism being allowed to take root in the guise of free speech, student protests, higher education?
I think this is a perfect example of why hate speech laws and the like are unworkable, because what you've basically seen in the US is an inversion of the positions on the right and the left. For a long time, it was sort of the left, progressive left, who, and I'm generalizing here, who said, we need to police language at universities that might be seen as offensive or racist to minorities, and the right was sort of saying, "Oh, the wokeism has run amok on university campuses. Censorship is under threat." Then these protests erupt, and suddenly you have people on the left who are willing to defend, even expressions of, there have definitely been peaceful protests, but there have also been instances of intimidation of Jewish students. And, you have seen at least some examples of students who sort of have pro-Hamas views or who will deny that there was sort of a massacre on October 7th. So this demonstrates two things, I think. First of all, we're never going to agree on what is hateful or not. And if you allow hate speech laws to target certain ideas, sort of the nonviolent expression of even offensive ideas, it will be whoever has the power to enact those and enforce them that will get to do it. In the context of what happened on October 7th, would say if you're saying from the river to the sea, Palestine should be free, that could be interpreted as a justification of what happened. I'm not saying that it necessarily is, but it could it could be seen as that, and that I think is a very strong case for why you should not have laws that police these things, especially when it comes to the U.S. It's worth comparing to what's happened in Europe. So in Germany, the crackdown on pro-Palestinian voices has been extreme. Conferences have been censored, have been banned. People have been arrested for shouting from the river to the sea. Police have come in the morning to arrest people for social media updates. That's what the First Amendment in the U.S. protects against, but which is being pushed by Republicans now. So I think it's really important to stand firm on a principled protection of free speech, even when it's offensive and hurtful. On the other hand, I also think it's important to say that some of these protests have gone further. There's a difference between allowing students to say things that the Jews and others might find offensive, and then saying you can intimidate them, or saying, well, you can occupy a public part of the university and prevent people who have different views from you from occupying, because then you violate the rights of free speech of other students. Just go ahead, David.
Right. I'm not at all in favor of Jewish students being intimidated, but there are instances of people claiming intimidation in situations that are not actually intimidating at all, and nobody has a kind of right to do that. And I would stack up the kind of the suffering of to Jewish Americans in these particular situations against what the violence that's been perpetrated against the people, the protesters, and also in the huger context, the mountain of carnage over in Gaza. And I think actually one of the unfortunate things about this particular debate is that is being extracted, children suffocating under rubble, babies suffocating under rubble, the number of people, and the appalling genocidal remarks made by high-ranking members of the Likud party, or whatever. The enormity of that, I think, actually really does make a lot of what we're talking about here really pale into insignificance.
Let me get to our global listeners now who've been listening in on our conversation. First up, we have Noor Trabelsi, originally from Tunisia, but working as a supply chain engineer in France. Noor, welcome. What's on your mind?
Thank you very much for this opportunity. I think my issue as a young person in general is that debates are being so polarized in the sense that people come to a debate on very opposite spectrums of discussion where they cannot meet. They can simply not meet from the beginning when they come to a debate. And this brings me to the question, is anyone legitimate to debate about anything despite the knowledge? Because it always seems like people must have the entire knowledge of the world about history, about deep philosophy, about sociology to be able to debate with him, or even to debate about a certain question. So it is very important to me to know if anyone is really legitimate. As a Muslim person, I've also encountered that debate, a big debate on Hamas and Israel, because from my personal point of view, with the two-state solution, I can't tolerate any misconduct towards any population. But it happened to me that I found myself attacked from both ways, like either attacked because I was a Muslim trying to defend Jewish people, differentiating between people and the Israeli government, or I was also attacked in a way that I was maybe trying to camouflage the anti-Semitism. So I found it getting really into a messy state where defending myself would be looking like I was justifying myself, when in real it was really my position, and I think nothing excludes the other. So this is where I sort of step out from these kind of debates.
David, Jakob, I wonder if you two could respond to what Noor has shared. David, starting with you.
Sure. I'm going to make the case against nuance here. One of the things, specifically with regards to the Israel-Palestine situation, quite often you'll say, like Zadie Smith in this essay in the New Yorker that you just wrote, and talk about the labyrinthine complexity. It's very complicated. It's very complicated. It always extreme 100,000. It's very, very complicated. Now that seems to me to be a means of warding people off from attempting to have an opinion or enter into an argument about it. It's very, very complicated. Now, there's an African-American guy who went to Gaza. This was a few years ago. And then people telling him, you need a degree in Middle East knowledge. It's so complex. And he got there and he saw the situation. He said, this is not complicated at all. And I think certain things can be like that sometimes, definitely. And in regard, what else we were saying, in terms of this idea of, I think we're kind of alluding it to the idea of compromise and finding kind of common ground. Again, I think there's sometimes games against that. I mean, I did a satire for this, a satirical piece for this BBC, this British website called Daily Mash, and it was a mock BBC controller. The Earth, is it flat or is it round? Or is it somewhere in between? No. There are certain issues, as far as I'm concerned, as is said on this, that's where Jack disagrees. I think there are, ultimately, you reach a point where, this is true, these are the facts, and certain things are played wrong.
Jakob, how do you see it?
I think, first of all, and I don't think that you should have any specific, qualifications necessarily to participate in debate. I'm a big believer in free and equal speech. So if you have something to say it. Of course, if someone is much more knowledgeable about you, then you risk being exposed in that debate, or you risk learning something if you have the intellectual humility to own up to that. And then I think it's quite a stretch to sort of compare flat eartherism to Israel, Gaza, and the trans debate. I think those debates are much more complex.
Let me get to our other global listener, Annalise Peterson, an undergraduate at Northwestern University near Chicago. Annalise, welcome. What's on your mind?
Hi, thank you so much. This has been super interesting. We've touched on it a couple of times in this conversation. But I think my generation in particular kind of grew up alongside social media, and we've seen how it's changed and how it's, for better or for worse, often the time, sort of the first choice of political engagement among people, particularly my age. And so I'm curious, especially for Jakob, I think that there's sort of a newer understanding of the way that these social media algorithms are actually operating, in the sense that not everyone is accessing the same information. And so, adopting what's most sensational, that garners the most attention. And in worst case scenarios, I think that can lead younger and more impressionable people down sort of rabbit holes of, political extremism and in worst case scenarios, violence. So I'm curious if you think that social media companies have a particular responsibility to filter or limit how people are accessing political information, or if their sort of hands-off approach is working effectively.
Let me hear from Jakob and then David briefly. Jakob?
Yeah, first of all, I don't think it's correct to say that social media companies have a hands-off approach. That might have been somewhat true in the sort of most techno-optimistic days and sort of maybe before 2015. But my organization has done lots of research that shows that the definitions of hate speech and other types of content are much more restrictive than what falls under law. So lots of content gets removed. And I think a lot of the content being removed is actually perfectly legal. And so I think that there's a bigger problem with over removal than under removal, if you like. But that doesn't change the fact that you're right in that platforms want to optimize for engagement. And so that means sensationalist content will often get more traction. That's not something new, because that's basically human psychology. There's a reason why tabloid newspapers sell more copies than the New Yorker. It's because they're very good at capturing our attention with sensationalist headlines and photos. But it's a different, the scale with social media is different from what we experienced before. And that's why, again, I want to come back to this idea of, first of all, having a more decentralized ecosystem for social media, rather than having one big platform whose algorithms push everyone in a certain direction, and allowing users more agency and power to determine what kind of content they want. I think that's sort of the least bad way forward.
David?
Yeah. Regarding Twitter, I mean, as I was saying earlier on, I actually did find if you properly curate, the people that you follow, I think it's actually a sort of tremendous boon, actually. I think you can get a huge range of information and links and whatever, and not just on your own side. Obviously, there are certain people who use it and just exist in their own bubble, and, it is just an echo chamber, so it does all depend on the individual user and what they do with it. Now, Jay was saying earlier on about a lot of people that don't use Twitter. It's not necessarily typical of people's sort of discourse. It's not typical of people's mode of discourse. However, I think that mainstream media does pick up on certain things, certain kerfuffles, as it were, certain kind of panics, whatever, that originated on Twitter. And I think the trans example is one of them. Sadly, it was just, like I say, it was a non-issue 10 years ago. Unfortunately, however, Twitter does also raise a lot of things that mainstream media should be picking up on and don't.
Jakob, let me start with you briefly. Areas where you feel that you and David have some common ground on this issue. And then, David, I'll wrap up with you. Jakob?
Well, I think we're both in agreement that people should not be put in jail for voicing their opinions. That the police state is not the way forward. As I hear David, it's all he's not necessarily even in favor of sort of massive deplatforming. I think we probably still disagree on where, when, and how people should be deplatformed. But it's a big step being in agreement that people should not be thrown in jail or arrested or subjected to surveillance because they have opinions that David might find as extreme right wing or transphobic or the like.
And David, before we go, areas of common ground?
Well, yeah, there's one that comes on that's very valuable, as Jacob mentioned, is that historically and perhaps globally, we are extremely privileged to be in the sort of place we are as regards free speech, and that should definitely not be taken for granted. I mean, those are huge points. I'm interested also in some of the kind of strategies that Jacob was mentioning in terms of developing how people use social media and what have you. I think that's very interesting as well.
David Stubbs, appreciate you making time for us today. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
And Jakob Mchangama, appreciate you sharing your views and insights. Thank you.
Thank you, Joshua.
Doha Debates is a production of the Qatar Foundation. Our podcast is produced by FP Studios and Doha Debates. Our producers include Mandy Lester, Laura Rossbrow-Tellem, Claudia Tatey, and Anna Peterson. FP Studios Managing Director is Rob Sachs. Our executive producers are Katrine Dermody, Japhet Weeks, Amjad Atala, and Jigar Mehta. To learn more about Doha Debates, you can go to Doha Debates, that's DOHA debates.com, where you can find out more about our other podcasts, short films, upcoming events, and more. And if you enjoyed this program, please follow the podcast and please write a review to help more people find the show. So until we meet again, I'm Joshua Johnson. Thanks for listening.